Good evening.
I'm not responsible for what she's saying.
No, not at all. But he taught me most of what I know. I'm Rabbi Rachel Sabbath Beit Halachmi, and I'm the director of the Shalom Hartman Institute Center for Lay Leadership, and it's a particular pleasure to introduce our rabbi and our teacher this evening. He's really obviously someone for whom really no introduction is necessary, right?
Okay.
However, we are recording this and sharing this with a variety of sites across North America. So a little introduction might be in order. David Hartman is a leading contemporary Jewish philosopher and internationally renowned author. He's the author of A Living Covenant, A Heart of Many Rooms, and Israelis and the Jewish Tradition, among several other books and many, many articles. And he's going to be testing you on all of these shortly, correct?
Right.
Absolutely. But perhaps more importantly for most of us here this evening, he has become one of the most important sources of intellectual inspiration, a mentor, a rabbi, a model for thousands, really thousands, hundreds and thousands of rabbis, teachers, educators, students, and senior officers in the IDF. So it is a great pleasure this evening as we begin our Lindenbaum lecture series this evening to introduce Rabbi David Hartman, Rabbi Professor David Hartman, who will speak on How is Prayer Possible After the Holocaust? Reflections on the relationship between creation and Mount Sinai. Welcome, Rabbi Professor David Hartman.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Rachel. I'm very happy that this is being channeled. What is it called? Internet? On the internet mean people all over the world can listen to the lecture now. Don't tell these people they won't come anymore. Okay. Now, I'm not going to answer that question immediately, but the purpose of my lectures is to make it intelligible how people can pray, or why people do pray, after living such an enormous, tragic experience. I want to distinguish, I'm going to set up certain conceptual categories, which I will then elaborate on the series of the Lindenbaum lectures. A, we have to distinguish between the metaphysical question in terms of how do we make sense of God, who he's either impotent or evil in response to the Holocaust. Either he's an evil God to allow such tragedies, or he's a finite, limited God who's not all-powerful. That's the metaphysical issue. How do we explain God's behavior in the Holocaust? The other issue is the existential issue, which interests me, is how do we live in a world where these things happen? What sense could we make of a religious life, or why people continue being devout, pious, knowing that this is possible in the world? It's very important to make this distinction, the metaphysical issue and the existential human issue. They have to be separated if we are to make sense of how we continue being a religious person in the world we live in. Or you could even put it even much more sharper, how did the Jewish people continue living by Torah, committed to the ongoing eternal covenant, and to make claims that the Torah is eternal after living through Churban Bayit Rishon, Churban Bayit Sheni, the destruction of the first temple, the destruction of the second temple, and a lot of Jewish history, which hasn't been a dream story. So that's, the issue is really, how do you make sense of the Jewish people? How do you make sense of this people who, in spite of what they experienced in history, felt the necessity to continue developing a religious life? This is what I call the human existential question, which interests me much more. The reason why it interests me more is because I don't know what God does or what his plans are. I don't have access to the divine mind or the divine will. I do have access to human beings who I live with, who can in some way shed light on the type of people they are and the religious life they live in. So I rather not speculate. I've read so many theological theodicies, and they're all mostly nonsense. If you think seriously that suffering is necessary so that you should know what the good is, suffering is necessary because it makes you more human. Suffering is necessary because it makes you humble. All this, I don't want to use my metaphors because it's on television now. And I've recently got a letter from a rabbi saying, how do I use such foul language in teaching Torah? So I sent him back and I told my staff, from now on, after each lecture, please go over before you record it, see if there's any phrases which are not too dignified. I can't stand being dignified a whole hour. After all, I am a Brooklyn boy, and I grew up in Brownsville, which is not necessarily a dignified neighborhood. So anyway, it's baloney. It is ill-conceived and intellectually timid and mistaken. Or there's another one which says, there must be a reason, we may not know it. That's Soloveitchik's move in Kol Dodi Dofek, which we're going to study the second semester. There is a reason. There must be a reason. And it must be justified. It must be a good moral reason. But we don't know it. So how do you know if there's a good reason if you don't know it? That's a different question. Well, that's my faith tells me that everything God does is good. That's not necessarily, on what basis do you make that claim? What do you see in the world that everything that happens in the world is good? The world is not a most inspiring place to live in most of the time, or a good part of the time. So I'm not interested in all these there's other attempts that evil is not real. Evil is the absence of good. So since it's an absence, it has no real reality. So then I'm saying to myself, therefore there's no problem of God with evil because evil doesn't exist. So I said, I don't know, when I have a headache, it seems to be real. I don't know this. Again, I don't tell you, I've spent 25 years being nauseated by all these so-called philosophical or theological attempts to really fathom the Holocaust, and to fathom evil in the world by the perspective of God. I think that there is an interesting question, is what image of God do you develop once you see this type of world? How do you think of God? Do you think of him as all-powerful? Do you think of him as weak? Do you think of him as empathic? What do you think of him? Do you still say, Tov Hashem Lakol, V'rachma Bal Kol Masav? Those are important questions you could ask yourself. Do you reconsider your belief standards given the presence of suffering in the world? Do you reconstruct for your own self Not necessarily, you don't know if it's true or not. The issue is, which God have you chosen to worship? And the issue is not how can you prove it, but because you say, that's me. That's how I want to live in the world, with this image of God. You can choose a different image. So in some sense, that is more interesting, because that's also an existential question. Because what you say is not necessarily truth. Who knows truth? It's boring truth. It's how do you picture your world? How do you allow God into the world, given what you see in the world? So therefore, my first question is an existential one. In other words, I have not answered how did the Holocaust, why do the righteous suffer? I don't know why, but I know they do. So that's it. How do I live in a world where the righteous do suffer? So sometimes in the prophets, it was done as an argument with God. All that language about an argument with God, I find totally meaningless. It is poetically nice. I mean, what are you arguing with God? You told him off. You won the argument. You took God to a din Torah. I mean, all that language. Okay, you took God to your Badicheva, you took God to the din Torah. You know the story they tell about the Badicheva? That there was a tailor who, when it came Yom Kippur, said in his prayers, he was a tailor who always cheated people in the garments he sold. He says, God, what I did, so I said, instead of 3 yards, it was 2.5 or 3.75. It was pitchifkis compared to what you did. And there's so many orphans and widows and homeless women and homeless young people, people lost in the world. I'll make a deal with you, God. You forgive me, and I'll forgive you. I heard that story, you remember? So the Badicheva said to him, Oy, Nareine, das can't bring in Mashiach. You could have brought the Messiah with your prayer. I don't know if you can bring Messiah. I don't know how God reacted to such a prayer. I don't know, how did the tailor know that God forgave him? But it's a nice story. It moves us, especially if it's on Yom Kippur, Kol Nidre, sermon, all these things. And you're going to read in the second semester Elie Wiesel's possibility of prayer in the post-Holocaust area. Again, protest. Promethean protest. God, you're trying to make me hate you by doing all those evil things. But I want you to know you're not going to succeed. I'm going to love you in spite of what you've done in the world. You read that and the neshama gets warm. No, doesn't it feel nice? But as a philosopher, I'm not satisfied. Doesn't answer my serious question. So that's why all metaphysical attempts, all theodicies, all theological quick motives just don't evaporate for me. It's like they say in Yiddish, wasserisch. It's watery. It has no teeth. So that's number one in terms of the category I want to deal with. A further category which is central to my thinking is, does morality trump halacha? Now, does halachic authority demand of you submission, even though you know it is fundamentally immoral? In other words, does God's authority in some way claim you, knowing innerly that this is morally wrong? And this is the question of the Akedah of Abraham. I mean, to murder your son is wrong. And that's what Kierkegaard's book, Fear and Trembling, deals with that. So if it's morally wrong, why did Abraham go up on the mountain with a knife? And why did Isaac put his neck in front? Job, why don't you curse God? Look what he's playing with you, especially you know what's going on. If you read the prologue of the book. Prologue of the book is ugly. He has to prove to the angels that Job is a righteous man. Or the Midrash says that the angels told God, how do you know that Abraham would serve you if you caused him to suffer? Because so far you've been very good to him. He became wealthy. He has property. He invests in real estate. The economy is sound. How do you know? So Rabbi says, okay, I'll test him. I mean, so what type of God is there who has to test him to prove to the angels? He must be very, very weak and insecure. So, I mean, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. So, in a sense, there are those who claim that obedience to God is demanded even when your moral conscience is violated. And among those are Leibovich, Soloveitchik, and others. And the whole meaning of the Akedah is the total obedience to God and to sacrifice your moral, intellectual sense on the altar of worship. Does living with God mean that you're living with an absolute despot who could control however you behave and could demand allegiance to you irrespective of what the law is doing? I mean, so what I often hear when I say I believe that morality should trump the halacha, I mean it should weaken the claim of the halacha upon you. So what I always get in the modern world is, how do you know what is moral? What is moral to you may not be moral to the other person. How do you overcome moral relativism? So I say, for example, there's a famous Maimonidean text, which is going to be fundamental to our understanding. Maimonides writes, in part 2, that if you believed, or if you know, that the world is eternal through a demonstrative truth, means a truth that you can't ignore, a truth that has absolute claim upon you, then he would reinterpret the whole Bible, which spoke about God as a creator. If demonstrative truth, not possible truth, but demonstrative, in other words, it's been established clearly that an ironclad argument that the world is eternal. So what are you going to do? Does you throw away the Bible because it speaks about creation, that the world is not eternal? He says, I'd reinterpret the whole Bible. I'd reinterpret the meaning of creation. I'd reinterpret it in such a way that it doesn't violate a demonstrative truth. So I've written and I make the claim that for us, morality has the same power that the medieval thought scientific demonstrative truth has. In other words, I don't have to be a great philosopher to know that the laws of divorce in the Jewish tradition are immoral. It gives men power to exploit and manipulate women. So I know what the Bible says, v'nosam biyodo, and the halacha developed, he has to give it to her, etc. And he has to say while he's giving it to her, to which women, and the name has to be clearly. I once went to the rabbinical courts, and they take so seriously the names. So what was the middle name? Perl, Breinzer, was hat man gerufen? And your name has to be clear. How'd they give you an aliyah? Is it, did people call you this name in the streets? I mean, they get so excited about making sure they wrote the right name as it was used in shul, not necessarily the one that was given to you at your birth. That bothers them enormously. That this woman is going to be exploited and denied the decency of support, as they say. But Shemus, names, it wouldn't be clear who was getting the divorce. So I don't need a profound moral, demonstrative truth that women who suffer by husbands who exploit them, that this is unjustified in anyone's normal range. Unjustified suffering. Causing suffering for no reason, without justification. Because his hair is black. That's the same thing. What they did to the blacks for so many centuries was unjustified. Pharaoh tried to give a reason because the Jews are different and therefore they're going to join the enemy. So he had a moral reason. But to kill children, they're not going to rebel against you. No, but you don't need to be a philosopher to know about elementary evil. To see a man kill a child, and a child looking in bewilderment, what are you doing to me? I don't have to go and then study Aristotle's ethics to know that this is wrong. An abused husband or an abused wife who gets beaten up because the cholent didn't turn out so well, I don't have to again study Plato or read John Rawls, leading ethicists in the 20th century, to know that this is wrong, this is a manubal. To cause a mamzer, a child born not through holy matrimony or through sexual permissiveness, that he can't marry the rest of his lifetime because his father and mother had illicit sex. So I'm not the only one who asked that question. The Midrash asked that question. The Midrash wonders, how's it possible? That's Dimat Hashukim in Vayikra Rabbah. The tears of the oppressed is the mamzer. And the oppressor is the Bezdin, the Sanhedrin, that uses the Torah to in some way exploit the mamzer. So God answers, don't worry, in the future I'm going to correct it. So I always say that's a cop-out. Why in the future? Why in the future? Because for the next 100 years, until Olam Haba and the Mashiach comes, there's going to be thousands of children who are going to be deprived of a normal life. So they spoke of Goren, who found a halachic way of permitting a mamzer to marry. Or, there's so many, where there is real evil, moral evil in the Bible, it's relationship between gender relationships. And therefore I applaud Mark Lurie for trying to work hard for a simple rule that the negotiation for settlement in marriage should be done before the decision on which Bezdin to go for the get. Because if you have to wait until the get gets worked out, then you could use that as an exploitative principle. So I think simple gender equality is, you don't have to be a philosopher. So I applaud Tova's creation of a shul that tries, not completely succeeds, that tries to make a woman feel dignified in shul. That she could hold a Torah, not stand in the balcony and watch. And that she can give a sermon, because she's intelligent. That she could be part of a minyan. I don't have to be a philosopher to say you're excluding this woman for no reason, just because she's a woman. She's not Sibur, she's not part of the community. It's morally wrong. So how do I deal with it? I deal with it by saying I'm not going to live by that. I don't accept it. So I'm going to choose a shul where people are treated with dignity and equality. That's what I mean by morality trumping. I'm not looking to feel I can find a responsa written in the 14th century that may give me a possibility of how to deal with it. To what degree does your moral conscience have the same weight that Maimonides says a truth established by philosophers and science has, which would force him to reinterpret the whole Torah? So for me, morality has the same power as a demonstrative truth. Principle number 2. I have to set up these foundational categories then to see how I deal with the Holocaust. I would deal with the Holocaust, I think, in the second or third lecture. First, I have to set up the building blocks. This is number 2. Number 3 is people have asked me, and in this pamphlet, I don't know if all of you have read A Heart of Many Rooms. Over here have read it. Did anybody, all of you read it? Most of you read it? Good. If you look, I took my glasses off when I asked that question. You saw that. Look at the end of the pamphlet. Now, I give examples of the interpretive community, of how they dealt with moral issues. And the classical text is the Ben Sora Umora. If you look at that, on page 10, not 10, 12. Okay. Dr. Solomon. Page 12. On the right-hand side. If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son. Right.
Stubborn, rebellious son who does not heed his father or mother and does not obey them, even after they discipline him, his mother and father shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his town and the public place of his community. They shall say to the elders of his town, "This son of ours is disloyal and defiant. He does not heed us. He is a glutton and a drunkard." Thereupon the men of his town shall stone him to death. Thus you will sweep out evil from your midst. All Israel will hear and be afraid.
Now, that's the biblical text. Now, the Talmud handles this text and raises important questions. Continue reading, Chaim, a little bit.
The Talmud in Sanhedrin 72a reads this text with the kind of free, seemingly playful, yet intensely serious attention I described at the beginning of this essay. At what point, the rabbis ask, does one become liable as a stubborn and rebellious son? In other words, what exactly did the guilty son described in Deuteronomy do? He was, they answer, citing the words of the parents in the above text, a glutton and a drunkard. He ate this kind of and amount of meat. He drank wine of such and such a vintage. He had, as they then proceed to describe, biblical equivalent of a serious teenage alcohol and drug problem. His sin, in other words, was not total rebellion, but a destructive addiction to eating and drinking and to related delinquent behavior.
Next page, but then,
asks one of the Talmudic teachers in rhetorical fashion, it has been taught, Rabbi Yosef Haglili said, did the Torah decree that the rebellious son shall be brought before Beit Din and stoned merely because he ate a tartamar of meat and drank a log of wine. In contrast to a biblical text that could be taken to mean that parental control over children was as absolute as over property and other possessions, the rabbis, in light of their assumption that parental authority over children must be limited, insist that the law in question must be justified by weightier reasons than parental prerogative or by gluttony and drunkenness. The Talmudic discussion continues. But the Torah foresaw his ultimate destiny, for at the end, after dissipating his father's wealth, he would still seek to satisfy his accustomed gluttonous wants, but, being unable to do so, would go forth at the crossroads and rob. Therefore the Torah said, "Let him die while yet innocent, and let him not die guilty." Although an earlier opinion had invoked an Akedah mode of argument, it is a divine decree to rule out an interpretation of biblical law that went beyond its literal meaning. This opinion alludes to suggestive aspects of the language of the text to bring broader social and moral considerations to bear on the issue at hand. First, the precise wording of the question, did the Torah decree that the rebellious son shall be brought before Beit Din, indicates the existence of a changed biblical social reality, where parental authority was no longer absolute and independent of social institutions such as the courts. They shall say to the elders of his town. This requirement stands in sharp contrast to the situation described in Genesis, where Judah, when learning of his daughter-in-law Tamar's alleged harlotry, proclaims, "Bring her out and let her be burned." Judah's parental status gave him the peremptory authority of judge and executioner over his family. By drawing attention to this subtle exegetical point, the Talmudic interpreter adopts a strategy aimed at deriving a moral defensible interpretation from an otherwise morally questionable biblical law. According to the Talmudic reference to the dangerous nature of the delinquency in question, the crime for which the son was so severely punished was not only rebellion against parents, but also what were believed to be the inevitable consequences of his current behavior. He is so addicted to his destructive habits and way of life that it is better for him to die now, while still relatively meritorious, than later, after he becomes a compulsive thief, murderer, and enemy of society. It is not, therefore, parental authority that is being so zealously protected, but the social fabric of society. This interpretive strategy is then extended to argue that only if the son's habitual behavior is of the type and intensity that invariably leads to the aforementioned criminal consequences is the law implemented. Here, then, is an interpretive move that preserves the legislative force of the text but shifts the context and meaning of the law away from the authoritative hierarchy of the family to the broader framework of social order and welfare. A third and more radical interpretive strategy makes the implementation of the law virtually impossible.
Turn the page.
There never has been a stubborn and rebellious son. There never will be, Rabbi Simon says. Because one eats a tartamar of meat and drinks half a log of Italian wine, shall his father and mother have him stoned? But it never happened and never will happen. Why then was this law written? That you may study it and receive reward.
In other words, they deny that they ever implemented this law. And then you see in the Talmud how they do it. The father and mother should take him. Means that both of them are able to walk. And they shall say, they should have the same voice. In other words, no distinction between the voice of the father and the voice of the mother. So in other words, they start giving requirements that make the implementation of this law simply impossible. The law doesn't apply because the conditions for implementation are simply out of the ballpark. The father and mother shall say, means they both have to be able to speak. They shall take, means they shall both have hands and the same strength. And this son of ours is a glutton and a drunkard or whatever that may be, so they have to then be able to point. And they give different requirements as a result of the way they read the text. So therefore the Mishnah said, Lo haya v'lo nivra. It never happened, because it could never happen. Same thing with the Ir Anidachat, the Gemara in Sanhedrin works. A city that worshipped idolatry is destroyed completely. So the Gemara again sees this crazy total punishment for some crimes of idolatry to destroy life completely. It's also impossible. So then they say if there was one house that had a mezuzah, then the city could never be condemned. If there was a chumash in a house, you can't destroy. So then the Gemara says again, Ir Anidachat, Lo haya v'lo nivra. Two classical biblical laws are just neutralized completely by an interpretive strategy that makes it impossible to be implemented. Now, my claim is this is an exegetical way of dealing with a moral problem. Unjustified punishment of a son, we have to find a way. We have to find a way to neutralize it. So we call what we call is an interpretive strategy. The text gets turned around in such a way that it seems strange. I remember when I was a kid studying in yeshiva, I said, but that's not what the text says. It doesn't say what the Gemara is requiring. I said, what do you mean, my Rebbe would say? That's what the Gemara means. B'neinu zeh. Our son. Therefore, they both have to speak, and they both have to have the same voice. They both have to be of the same height. So go find a husband and wife who have the same voice, same height, same strength, and all the conditions that the Talmud gives. So I used to say to myself, but that seems a joke, no? That's not what the text means. So the only answer my Rebbe can give, if they interpreted it that way, that's what the text means. So I remember when I asked yeshiva boys once, do you think that when Jacob came to steal the blessing from Esau, that he really told the truth? When his father says the voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau. And the father was very uncomfortable with Jacob's deception. But he didn't know because he was going blind. He couldn't see. So Rashi comments that in some way, he says, is Esau Habchor Chai Imzeh Yaakov? So Yaakov's answer was, yes. Yes what? That you are the Esau? Oh yes, I'm your son. But the whole context he's saying he's lying. He's deceiving. So I said to the yeshiva boys, do you think Jacob was telling the truth? So the answer I got, Rashi says that's what he said. So what I saw is that there was no moral voice in these young people to say something against Rashi. So what happens when you do this to the text? When you pilpul around? What it did for me and for my children many times is it made the Bible into a joke. Not serious. Because if you could reinterpret the Bible that way, then you're really saying it doesn't say anything explicit. I could make it say what I wanted to say. So the whole way of satisfying your moral considerations makes the Bible itself into a silly book. But that was the preference of the rabbinic tradition. You change the law only through exegetical shtick. You never said, this is wrong, let's stop it. Let's not continue. No, the law is eternal. So to God that the law is eternal, you make the book itself seem a silly, foolish book that doesn't seem to have any coherent thinking. I mean, I want you to take the Gemara Sanhedrin at home, read the text, and see the qualifications they bring. And then tell me, go back to the biblical text and tell me, do you think that's the meaning of the text? I'm willing to give $100 to anyone who could say that honestly, that he thinks that's the meaning of the text. He would say, no, they're playing. So in order to guard the sanctity of Torah, you neutralize its total sanctity. You make it into a plaything. So that I prefer saying it's wrong than to saying they never said it, when they did say it. So what strategy do you take? Do you take the exegetical? That was a Talmudic strategy. Or do you take an honest strategy? How can you kill a son because he's drank too much wine? How does he have the whole community stone someone because he likes steak and drinks a lot of beer? Boy, they'd have to stone half the people in Jerusalem. You have to go along Emek Rephaim and wipe out most of the people in the restaurants. This is a country that never stops eating. So are they Ben Sora Mora? Don't tell the rabbinate about what I'm saying now, because they're liable to think, gee, maybe we ought to do that. I never put it past them. So in a sense then, choice. Say the text doesn't mean what it says because it can't mean what it says because it's morally wrong. You understand? It can't say that, but it does say that. So you know it's morally wrong. So then say it's morally wrong and don't implement it. No. Now that was an old traditional way of dealing with morally problematic texts. Meiri does it as well. When the text speaks about Goyim, it doesn't mean Goyim, it means somebody else. When it says Christians, it doesn't mean Christians, it means somebody else. It means people who are barbarians. And that's how he cleans up all the Talmudic references to the non-Jew, which is fundamentally abhorrent. That if a guy is dying on Shabbos, so you're allowed to call a doctor. From the Mishnah, you're not allowed. You never desecrate the Sabbath to save the life of a non-Jew. But the Meiri says, no, that can't be. It can't be. So what is the text referring to? He has to save the text. Save the text. Why save it? Can't you let it go? When I read Aristotle and he says he's for slavery, what do I have to give a drei? He doesn't mean slavery. He means people who are, murderers. Crooks, gangsters, terrorists. That's what he meant. Terrorist. Osama bin Laden. Okay, Aristotle, did you mean that? Aristotle would turn over in his grave and say, what are you talking about? I wrote simply what I meant. So can't we read the text and be able to say to the text, it is wrong. It violates my normal moral integrity. Can you say that the laws of divorce, as found in the Talmud, is wrong? That's all wrong. Their perception of women is wrong. Let's go on with the show. There's other nice things in the Torah. What do I have to say yes to everything? If I have to say yes to everything, then I'm saying yes to things I don't really feel. I have to give a drei. My father hit me in the face, but he did it out of love. He says, don't think I'm punishing you. I remember that used to be the spiel. Tell your kid you love him. And the patch is just a way of him expressing your love. I don't know which kid ever felt that the patch he got from his father was the way his father was showing love. His father was showing anger. So your father then does things wrong? Yeah. I don't have to drei and give a pshetel and give a Freudian analysis. No, it's wrong. Can't we admit that there is not total perfection? Can't we admit that God is wrong by demanding of Abraham this? We can't. Because the question is what happens when you enter into a religious culture. This is Maimonides' Why for me, Maimonides is so important? To what point do you say, I have to have a self-insulated system which is always right, always moral, always just, when it isn't? When it isn't according to normal moral instincts. Now, isn't it safer to say there were times when people thought that this was normal? You know, a father the children were seen as property. We don't see that way anymore. Children are not property, so therefore you can't do with them whatever you want. So can't you admit that? Does that undermine the sanctity of the system? What I'm arguing for is to give credibility and power for morality to act as an interpretive principle as to how you read the text and how do you accept the authority of the text. This is, to me, essential. If a person doesn't have that, then I don't know what type of human being we're creating. I mean, if a human being can't say it's wrong when it is wrong, when it's nasty, when it's depriving people of their own human dignity, when it makes a woman into a chattel. As my father would say, a woman has to just be pregnant to make a kugel. That was his perception of my mother. And when my mother would daven and learn in the house, he would get scared. Pesel, prepare the child. Am I going to say, Pa, you have a proper understanding of women? Or will I say, in Meisharim, that's how they saw people. But Pa, you have to understand we're living now in Brooklyn. And you can't look at a woman that way anymore. He would say, Du wirst nicht was du redest. He would understand it. You absolutize immorality when you are living in a religious culture. That's the great danger of an authoritarian system. And sometimes when you talk with people about this, they don't understand. You shake them up and say, don't you see that it was wrong to destroy a whole world in the Dor HaMabul? That was genocide of the highest level? Was a Holocaust to destroy life completely? Because they had some sexual promiscuity at the end of the chapters in Genesis? It's horrible. It's wrong. So I told my son at his bar mitzvah, don't ever give up your own normal, moral, healthy sense. And if you feel it's wrong, it's wrong. Your wife just came in. He's over here. In other words, I have a different theory about loyalty. Loyalty is not submission and obedience, regardless of its moral cost, but that the Torah has to be judged by normal human moral standards. And you can't put on a so-called religious cap and say, well, that's what the Torah says. But you can't. When you do that, something gets destroyed. Now, for me, now we're moving into interesting territory. Because when it comes now, how does Abraham do this? How do we make sense of the Akedah? See, I'm setting this up. If what I claim that Abraham really demanded of God that he act normally moral. That's why the prayer of Sodom is so important for me. Okay, let's look at that text and the contrast of that text with the Akedah. I've never dealt with it in all of my writings. This year I decided that I'm going to have to deal with the Akedah. Is my Rebbe in Leibovitz right? Does the Akedah story tell me that obedience is the norm, of a serious religious person? Does he have to read the Akedah and say, Abraham, you showed your absolute loyalty to whom? To whom did you show your loyalty? To someone who asked you to kill your son? How do you even do that? So Van Rad speaks about, and Christian theologians speak, that faith demands obedience, total obedience. That's what it means to be a man of faith. If that's what it means to be a man of faith, then some more vital principle of mine, which acts as the central organizing framework for my whole theology, the covenant is destroyed.